I couldn't resist the moment I met him. Hi everyone, and welcome to the channel Infidelity Stories, I had always been close to Daniel's family, especially after we started dating. At first, I found the constant family gatherings exhausting, but I grew accustomed to them. His grandparents' house was lively, and I felt more at ease with his family than my own. His grandmother, Sarah, was always busy in the kitchen, and his grandfather, Richard, was the life of the party, full of stories from his youth. One Saturday, Daniel and I went to his grandparents for lunch, just like we usually did. As Sarah cooked, Daniel helped Richard with the grill, and I stayed in the kitchen talking to Sarah. That day, something felt different. I noticed Richard glancing at me from the backyard. At first, I dismissed it, thinking it was nothing, but as the day went on, those glances became more intense, making me uncomfortable. During lunch, I could hardly focus. Every time I looked up, Richard was watching me. Daniel, oblivious to it all, carried on like everything was normal. Later, while Daniel napped in the living room, I stayed behind to help clean up. Richard came into the kitchen, and the air between us felt thick. He stood too close and complimented me in a way that felt unsettling. His words had a double meaning, something that made me feel confused and nervous. I rushed out of the kitchen, heart racing, the following weekend, we returned for a quieter lunch. Once again, I felt that tension with Richard. He found moments to speak to me in private, and this time, he wasn't subtle. He said there was a connection between us, something he felt was special. My heart raced. I knew it was wrong, and yet, a part of me couldn't deny feeling drawn to him. I tried to resist, to tell him it was absurd, but the more I pushed him away, the harder it became to control my feelings, over the next few weeks, I found myself thinking about Richard, even when we weren't at their house. It became a strange, confusing cycle, and I hated how trapped I felt. I started avoiding Daniel's family gatherings, coming up with excuses to avoid Richard. But no matter how hard I tried, the tension between us persisted, and I knew something had to give, one weekend, Daniel invited me to another family lunch. I wanted to make an excuse, but he insisted. During the lunch, Richard's glances were more deliberate, and I could feel the weight of what was about to happen. After lunch, Daniel left for the store with his grandmother, leaving me alone with Richard. He wasted no time. He came closer, and this time, there was no ambiguity. He kissed me, and in that moment, I didn't resist, immediately after, I felt overwhelming guilt. I knew I had crossed a line, and yet, a part of me had given in. The rest of the day passed in a blur, my mind spinning with what I had done. I left the house that day knowing that everything had changed, the more I tried to convince myself I was overreacting, the harder it was to ignore that feeling. Every glance, every subtle interaction with Richard replayed in my mind. I would find myself thinking about him even when I wasn't at their house. I hated that these thoughts lingered, that they distracted me from my life with Daniel, but I couldn't make them stop, the next time Daniel and I went back to his grandparents' house, it was supposed to be an ordinary visit. I went with a tight knot of anxiety in my chest, already knowing something was going to happen. And, just as I feared, it didn't take long for things to escalate, after lunch, Daniel and his grandmother went to the store to pick up some things for dessert, leaving me alone with Richard. This time, he didn't waste any time. He approached me, his eyes locking onto mine with an intensity that made my pulse quicken. He didn't say much at first, just stood there watching me. I could feel the silence closing in on me, the air thick with tension, then, without warning, he spoke. "I haven't been able to stop thinking about you," he said. His voice was low, almost a whisper, like it was meant only for me. "And I know you've been thinking about me too, my heart hammered in my chest. I opened my mouth to deny it, to tell him he was wrong, but the words stuck in my throat. Deep down, I knew he was right, and that truth scared me more than anything. I had been thinking about him, about that forbidden connection between us. It was wrong, and I knew it, but that didn't make it go away, I tried to resist. "This is crazy," I whispered, taking a step back. Daniel could walk in any second, but Richard didn't move. He just smiled, that calm, knowing smile, as if he wasn't afraid of anything. "Daniel isn't here. It's just us, in that moment, all the rational thoughts in my mind, All the guilt, all the shame, they melted away. It was as if the pull between us was stronger than any sense of right or wrong. I stood there, frozen, while he closed the distance between us. His hand reached out, brushing my arm gently, sending shivers down my spine. I should have stepped back, should have walked away, but I didn't, then, he kissed me, it was like my body moved on its own, giving in to something I'd been fighting for too long. The kiss was soft at first, hesitant, like we both knew the line we were crossing. But within seconds, it deepened, became more urgent. My heart was racing, my thoughts were in chaos, but I didn't pull away, when it was over, I stepped back quickly, breathless, my mind reeling from what had just happened. The reality of it hit me like a ton of bricks. What had I done? This was Daniel's grandfather, for God's sake. What was wrong with me? I need to go, I stammered, backing away, the guilt already rising like a tidal wave inside me. This can't happen again, Richard didn't try to stop me. He just looked at me with that same calm expression, like he knew something I didn't. No one has to know, he said. Softly. This can stay between us, I fled from the house, barely able to breathe. Daniel returned a little while later, completely oblivious to what had just transpired. He was laughing, talking about how his grandmother had forgotten half the ingredients they needed, and I forced a smile, trying to pretend everything was normal. But inside, I was falling apart, over the next few days, I couldn't stop thinking about it. The guilt weighed heavily on me, but so did the memory of that kiss. I hated myself for it, but at the same time, I couldn't deny the pull I still felt toward Richard. It was wrong, it was disgusting, and yet, I couldn't stop, Richard kept texting me, sending me subtle messages, testing the waters. At first, I ignored them, hoping I could just pretend nothing had happened and move on with my life. But every time his name appeared on my phone, that same thrill ran through me, and it became harder and harder to resist. I started making excuses to avoid going to Daniel's grandparents' house, telling him I was busy or not feeling well. He didn't suspect a thing. He was sweet, caring, always understanding. The guilt gnawed at me even more, knowing how much he trusted me, how much he loved me, while I was keeping this terrible secret from him. Then, one day, Daniel insisted we go over for another family lunch. I couldn't come up with a good enough excuse, so I reluctantly agreed, my stomach churning the whole way there. I knew I had to face Richard again, and I had no idea how I was going to handle it. The moment we arrived, I could feel his eyes on me. From across the yard, Richard gave me that same knowing look, like he already knew I wasn't going to be able to resist for long. After lunch, Daniel went out with his grandmother to pick up some things from the store, just like before, leaving me alone with Richard once again, this time, I knew what was coming, and yet, I didn't stop it. When he came closer, I felt that same rush of excitement and dread all at once. I knew I should push him away, but I didn't. I couldn't, it's not too late to walk away, I said, my voice shaky, though I didn't really believe it. My heart was racing, my body betraying me even as I tried to keep some semblance of control, Richard just smiled, a soft, confident smile, as if he knew how this was going to end. And maybe, deep down, I knew too, he kissed me again, and this time, I didn't resist, as Richard's lips met mine again, all the guilt and hesitation melted away. For a brief moment, it felt as if the world had stopped, and all that existed was this overwhelming, forbidden attraction between us. But the moment passed, and reality came crashing back down on me with the weight of everything I was doing, betraying Daniel, deceiving a family that had welcomed me with open arms. I pulled away suddenly, my breath ragged and my mind reeling with the gravity of what had just happened. I can't keep doing this, I whispered, more to myself than to him. My heart was pounding in my chest, and a sick feeling of regret began to take root, Richard didn't say anything at first. He just looked at me with that same calm, unreadable expression. No one has to know, he repeated softly, his voice steady, almost reassuring. This can stay between us, but I wasn't sure anymore. I wasn't sure if I could handle the weight of the secret any longer. I wasn't sure if I could keep living with the guilt gnawing at me every day, I needed to get out of there. I needed space to breathe, to think, to clear my head. I need to go, I said, stepping away from him, my hands trembling. I didn't wait for a response. I turned and walked out of the room, grabbing my bag and heading for the front door, as I stepped outside, the cool air hit my face, and I inhaled deeply, trying to calm the storm inside me. But no matter how hard I tried, the guilt and confusion lingered, swirling in my mind. I felt like I was trapped in a nightmare of my own making, with no way out. Daniel and his grandmother came back soon after, their arms full of grocery bags and smiles on their faces. Daniel walked over to me and kissed me on the cheek, completely unaware of what had just happened moments before. His smile was so genuine, so full of love, and it made my chest tighten with guilt. I felt like a terrible person. Everything okay? He asked, noticing the strange look on my face. Yeah, I'm fine, I lied, forcing a smile. Just a little tired, Daniel nodded, wrapping his arm around me. We'll head home soon, he said gently. Don't worry, the ride home felt like a blur. I barely heard a word Daniel was saying as I sat in the passenger seat, my thoughts racing, heart heavy with the weight of the secret I was carrying. I was living a double life, and it was slowly tearing me apart. For the next few days, I tried to focus on work, school, anything to distract myself from the mess I had gotten into. I avoided any contact with Richard, ignoring his messages and coming up with excuses to stay away from Daniel's grandparents' house. But the harder I tried to distance myself, the more my mind kept going back to that kiss, to the pull between us that I couldn't seem to escape. Then, one night, everything came crashing down. Daniel and I were lying in bed, his arm draped over me as he fell asleep beside me. I stared at the ceiling, wide awake, my mind racing. The guilt had become unbearable. I couldn't keep pretending anymore. I couldn't keep deceiving him. I shifted in bed, turning to look at him. He looked so peaceful, so trusting. And in that moment, I knew what I had to do. I had to tell him the truth. I couldn't live with this secret any longer. Daniel, I whispered, my voice shaking. He stirred beside me, slowly waking up. What is it? He asked sleepily, rubbing his eyes. I swallowed hard, feeling a lump form in my throat. I need to tell you something, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. He blinked, sitting up slightly, his expression turning serious. What's wrong? I took a deep breath, my heart pounding in my chest. There's something I've been hiding from you, I said, my voice trembling. Something I'm not proud of. Daniel frowned, confusion and concern written all over his face. What are you talking about? Tears welled up in my eyes as I struggled to find the words. How could I possibly tell him the truth? How could I explain what I had done, the betrayal I had committed? I've been keeping something from you, I began, my voice breaking. And I don't know how to say this, but it's about your grandfather. Daniel's face paled, and his eyes widened in shock. What about him? He asked, his voice laced with confusion and fear. The words were caught in my throat. I wanted to confess everything, to come clean and beg for his forgiveness, but I couldn't. The weight of it all was too much, and I was terrified of what it would do to him, to us. I'm sorry, I whispered, my voice barely audible. I can't do this anymore. Daniel stared at me, his expression a mix of hurt and confusion. What do you mean? What are you talking about? I shook my head, tears streaming down my face. I'm so sorry, Daniel, I sobbed. I've made a terrible mistake, and I don't know how to fix it. He looked at me, his eyes filled with pain. What did you do? I couldn't answer him. I couldn't bring myself to say the words. The truth was too ugly, too painful, and I knew that once I said it, there would be no going back. Daniel's face crumpled, and he turned away from me, his body tense. I don't know what's going on, he said quietly, but whatever it is, I hope you'll tell me when you're ready. And with that, he got up and left the room, leaving me alone with the crushing weight of my guilt. For the next few days, I avoided him. I couldn't face him, couldn't bear to look him in the eyes knowing what I had done. But I knew that eventually, the truth would come out, and when it did, everything would fall apart. And so, I waited, caught between the desire to confess and the fear of losing everything. Days passed, and the weight of the secret was becoming unbearable. Daniel and I barely spoke. He sensed that something was wrong, but he didn't press me for answers. His patience made the guilt even worse. Every time he looked at me, I felt like I was suffocating under the burden of what I hadn't told him. One afternoon, after another strained lunch with Daniel's family, I couldn't take it anymore. Richard's lingering glances, the tension that hung in the air, it was all too much. Daniel noticed my discomfort, but again, he didn't ask. Maybe he was afraid of the answer, or maybe he trusted me too much to think I was capable of something so awful, I wanted to tell him everything, but I was paralyzed by fear of losing him, fear of the fallout with his family, fear of admitting to myself how far I had let things spiral out of control. I knew I had to make a choice, either come clean and face the consequences or continue down this dangerous path, deceiving everyone, but fate has a way of making decisions for you. It was a Sunday afternoon, and Daniel had invited his grandparents over for dinner at his apartment. I had been dreading this all week, knowing I'd be stuck in close quarters with Richard, pretending like nothing had happened. I had tried to get out of it, making excuses about work and school, but Daniel insisted. I couldn't avoid it forever, the dinner started off innocently enough. We made small talk, Sarah complimented the meal, and Daniel was his usual, cheerful self. But Richard was there, silent, his eyes occasionally drifting toward me, that same intensity simmering beneath the surface. I could feel it like a physical presence between us, suffocating me, After dinner, Daniel stepped out to grab dessert from the bakery down the street, leaving me alone with his grandparents. I busied myself in the kitchen, trying to avoid Richard's gaze, my heart racing as I washed dishes. I could feel him watching me, waiting, and then, it happened. Richard followed me into the kitchen, moving closer, his voice low. "You know we need to talk about this," he said softly, his breath warm on the back of my neck, I froze, the dish in my hand slipping back into the soapy water. I didn't turn around. I couldn't face him, "There's nothing to talk about," I said, my voice shaky. "This has to stop." "It was a mistake, Richard didn't back down. He moved closer, standing just behind me, so close I could feel the heat of his body. "You and I both know that's not true," he murmured. "We've already crossed that line. You can't pretend it didn't happen, I shut my eyes, my hands trembling. "Daniel's going to come back any minute," I whispered, trying to sound firm, but my voice betrayed me. I was scared, and he knew it, "He won't find out," Richard said, his voice calm, reassuring. "Not unless you want him to." I turned to face him, my heart pounding in my chest. "Please," I said, my voice breaking. "This is wrong. We have to stop, Richard's expression softened, but his eyes still held that same intensity. "You don't want to stop," he said quietly. "Not really, just then, the front door opened, and Daniel's voice called from the hallway. "I'm back. Got the desserts, I quickly stepped away from Richard, turning back to the dishes, my heart hammering in my chest. I could feel the heat rising to my face, the guilt and panic swirling inside me. I couldn't keep doing this. It had to end, the rest of the evening passed in a blur. Daniel was oblivious, chatting happily with his grandparents, while I sat in silence, trying to keep my composure. I couldn't stop thinking about what had just happened in the kitchen, about how close I had come to something even worse, that night, when everyone had left and Daniel and I were alone. He finally confronted me, "What's going on with you?" he asked gently as we sat on the couch. "You've been acting weird for weeks. I know something's bothering you, and I want to help, but I can't if you don't talk to me, his words cut through me like a knife. I stared at him, my heart aching with the weight of my secret. He didn't deserve this. He didn't deserve any of it, tears welled up in my eyes, and I swallowed hard, trying to hold them back. "Daniel, I started, my voice trembling. I wanted to tell him everything. I wanted to confess, to beg for his forgiveness, to somehow make things right. But the words stuck in my throat, too heavy to speak, he reached for my hand, his expression full of concern and love. "You can tell me anything," he said softly. "Whatever it is, we'll figure it out together, The tears finally spilled over, and I shook my head, pulling my hand away. "You don't understand," I whispered, my voice breaking. I've done something terrible, Daniel's face changed, confusion giving way to fear. "What do you mean?" he asked, his voice tense. "What have you done?" I couldn't look at him. I couldn't bear to see the hurt in his eyes. "I've been lying to you," I said, my voice barely audible. "I've been keeping something from you, about your grandfather, Daniel's face paled, his eyes widening in shock. My grandfather, he repeated, disbelief coloring his voice. What about him? I took a deep breath, my hands trembling. This was it. There was no turning back now, I've been seeing him, I admitted, my voice shaking. We kissed. It was a mistake, but it happened. And I didn't know how to tell you. I'm so sorry, the room went silent, the air thick with tension. Daniel just stared at me, his face drained of color, his eyes wide with shock and hurt. For a moment, he didn't say anything, as if he was trying to process what he had just heard. Then, slowly, the realization hit him, and his expression twisted into one of pain and betrayal, What? He whispered, his voice barely audible, as if he couldn't believe the words. You, and my grandfather, I nodded, tears streaming down my face. I'm so sorry, I choked out. It was a horrible mistake. I never meant for it to happen, I never wanted to hurt you, but Daniel wasn't listening. He stood up, pacing the room, his hands shaking with anger and disbelief. I can't believe this, he muttered, his voice rising. You, and my grandfather? How could you do this to me? I'm sorry, I sobbed, standing up, reaching for him. I didn't mean for any of this to happen. I know I've messed up, and I'll do anything to make it right. Please, just, let's talk about this. But Daniel backed away, his face a mixture of pain and fury. I can't even look at you right now, he spat, his voice trembling. You betrayed me. You, and with my own grandfather? I can't even process this, he grabbed his jacket and keys, heading for the door. I need space, he said sharply, his voice thick with emotion. Don't call me. Don't talk to me. I need to figure out what the hell I'm going to do, and with that, he slammed the door behind him, leaving me standing alone in the apartment, my chest heaving with sobs, as the door slammed shut behind Daniel. The echo seemed to linger in the apartment, amplifying the silence that followed. I stood frozen in place, tears streaming down my face as the weight of what had just happened crushed me. The truth was out now, and it had shattered everything, I collapsed onto the couch, burying my face in my hands, sobbing uncontrollably. There was no turning back. Daniel knew. And I couldn't blame him for reacting the way he did. I had betrayed him in the worst possible way with his own grandfather, a man he loved and respected. The guilt that had been gnawing at me for weeks now felt like a lead weight, sinking deeper into my chest, hours passed, though I wasn't sure how many. Time seemed to blur as I sat there, lost in a haze of guilt and regret. I had destroyed everything, my relationship with Daniel, the trust we had built, my place in his family. And for what? A fleeting, forbidden attraction that had spiraled out of control. I kept replaying everything in my mind, wondering how I had let it go this far, when I finally stopped crying, I felt empty, hollow. I knew I couldn't stay in that apartment, surrounded by the reminders of what I had just lost. I needed to leave, to get away, but I had no idea where to go. Everything felt uncertain, broken beyond repair, I packed a bag in a daze, not thinking too much about what I was putting into it. I just knew I needed to be somewhere else, away from the weight of my mistakes. I scribbled a note for Daniel, though I doubted he would even care to read it, I'm sorry. I'm leaving for a while to give you space. I never meant to hurt you, and I know that doesn't change anything. I hope one day you can forgive me. I placed the note on the kitchen table and left the apartment, my heart heavy with a mixture of shame and sorrow. I had no idea where I was going, but it felt like I needed to be anywhere but there, days passed, and I stayed with a friend who didn't ask too many questions. I didn't tell her everything, only that Daniel and I were going through something serious, and I needed some time alone. She was kind enough not to push for details, giving me the space I needed to process everything that had happened, but as the days turned into weeks, I realized something else. I was still waiting. Waiting for Daniel to reach out, for some kind of sign that he was ready to talk. But there was nothing. No messages, no calls. It was as though I had vanished from his life completely, and maybe that's exactly what he needed, I couldn't blame him. I knew how much pain I had caused, and I had no right to expect forgiveness. But the silence was deafening, a constant reminder of the bridge I had burned. Then one evening, after another long, sleepless night, I received a text. My heart jumped when I saw Daniel's name flash on the screen, _we need to talk. Come over tomorrow. My stomach churned. This was it. The moment I had been dreading and hoping for all at once. I didn't know what to expect, whether he was ready to hear me out or if he just wanted closure. But I knew I had to face him. I owed him that much, The next day, I arrived at Daniel's apartment, my nerves frayed, my heart racing. I knocked on the door, and when he opened it, I could immediately tell that something had changed. He looked tired, like he hadn't slept much, but his eyes were calm, not filled with the anger and betrayal I had seen the last time, We sat down in the living room, an awkward, heavy silence between us. I waited for him to speak, not sure what to say. Finally, he took a deep breath and looked at me, I've had some time to think, he said quietly. And I still don't know how to process everything you told me, I nodded, biting my lip. I understand, I said softly. I don't expect you to forgive me. I'm so sorry for everything, Daniel looked down at his hands, which were resting on his lap. You didn't just hurt me, he said after a moment. You broke my trust. And, it's not something that I can just fix overnight, tears welled up in my eyes, and I blinked them back, trying to hold myself together. I know, I whispered. I don't know how to fix it either, he sighed, leaning back on the couch, as if the weight of it all was still pressing down on him. But I also can't keep holding on to all this anger, he continued. It's been eating me alive. I've spent weeks wondering how we got here, and it's messed with my head. I'm trying to understand why you did it. Why him, his question hung in the air, and I struggled to find the right words. How could I explain something I didn't fully understand myself? I don't know, I admitted, my voice breaking. It wasn't something I planned, or even wanted. It just happened. And I let it go too far. I hate myself for it, and I know that doesn't make it better, but I was confused. I didn't know how to stop it, Daniel closed his eyes for a moment, as if absorbing my words. I don't think I'll ever really understand it, he said finally. But I need to figure out what I'm going to do with that. With us. I nodded, my heart heavy with the knowledge that there might not be an us anymore. I understand if you can't forgive me, I said quietly. And if you need to move on. I won't blame you, he was silent for a long time, his expression unreadable. I don't know if I can forgive you, he said slowly, but I don't know if I'm ready to let go either, that admission hung in the air between us, fragile and full of uncertainty. Neither of us knew what the future held, but in that moment, it was clear that the road ahead wasn't going to be easy. We were both broken, and there was no quick fix for the damage that had been done, I need time, Daniel said eventually. To figure out how I feel, to figure out what comes next, I nodded, wiping away a tear. Take all the time you need, we sat there in silence for a while longer, both of us lost in our own thoughts. The path forward was unclear, and I didn't know if we would ever truly find our way back to each other. But for the first time in weeks, I felt like I could breathe again, knowing that at least we had started the conversation. That maybe, just maybe, there was a chance for healing, even if it wasn't the way I had imagined, as I left Daniel's apartment that day, I realized that no matter what happened, I had to learn to forgive myself too. The mistakes I had made, the pain I had caused, it would take time, but I knew I had to face it, to own it, if I was ever going to move forward. And as much as it hurt, I knew that facing the truth was the only way to begin again, even if the future was still uncertain, the truth came out like a wound tearing open. Daniel's face paled as I confessed everything, my mistake, my betrayal with his grandfather, Richard. I saw the hurt in his eyes, and for a moment, I wished I could take it all back. But there was no undoing what had already been done. He left without saying much, only asking for space, leaving me standing alone in the apartment, guilt consuming me. The days that followed were painful. I couldn't sleep, couldn't think straight. I had broken Daniel's trust, and I didn't know how to fix it. We stopped talking, and I gave him the distance he needed, knowing there was nothing I could do but wait, weeks passed, and just when I thought I'd lost him for good, Daniel texted me, asking if we could talk. I wasn't sure what to expect, but I knew this was my only chance to explain, when we sat down in his apartment, Daniel was quiet, almost distant. He told me that while he wasn't sure if he could forgive me, A part of him wasn't ready to let go. He wanted to try, but with one condition: I had to cut all contact with his grandfather. I agreed without hesitation. I was ready to do whatever it took to start over, the next few weeks were strained. We tried to rebuild, but the trust between us was fragile, and every conversation felt loaded with the weight of my betrayal. I blocked Richard's number, avoided his family gatherings, and focused solely on earning back Daniel's trust. Still, things weren't the same. One night, Daniel asked me why I had done it, why I had betrayed him with his grandfather. I struggled to explain, realizing I didn't fully understand it myself. I told him the truth: it wasn't about Richard, it was about me. I had let myself get caught up in the secrecy, in something I should have stopped. I regretted it deeply, but I didn't have a good answer. Daniel listened quietly. It was clear that he was trying to move forward, but the hurt lingered. Slowly, though, we began to reconnect. We laughed more, talked more openly, and shared moments of honesty. It wasn't easy, and it wasn't perfect, but we were trying. As for Richard, he faded from my life. I hadn't heard from him since cutting ties, and as time passed, the regret I felt for my mistake became a part of my past, no longer something I carried with me every day. Daniel and I continued to work on our relationship. There were still hard days, but we were learning to rebuild what we once had. It was a long, slow process, but for now, we were moving forward, and that was enough. End of the story. Before you leave, remember to subscribe to the channel by activating the Tinkerbell to receive notification every time. Daniel and I continued to work on our relationship. There were still hard days, but we were learning to rebuild what we once had. It was a long, slow process, but for now, we were moving forward, and that was enough. End of the story. Before you leave, remember to subscribe to the channel by activating the Tinkerbell to receive notification every time.